Hey, boo, it's me, Lutzi Sagu, your favorite gender studies professor who lives on the internet, and I am back with another conversation. And this week, we're going to be, in this video, we're going to be talking about climate disaster, and how it intersects with white supremacy, and how we need to be taking it seriously. I personally think that as progressives, as people who identify as leftists, and just generally those of us who find ourselves on the leftist spectrum, I'm very concerned about how much we're not talking about the climate disaster, and how climate and what's happening doesn't factor into our daily and future planning, thinking, and behaviors. Y'all know that I live in South Florida. We know that the waters are gonna rise, but almost every friend I've had in the last 2-3 years has purchased a house. So that's real. No judgment, no shade. And we do know the water is coming. And South Florida is built on limestone, which means it doesn't matter where you are in the county, that rock is porous. The water is gonna rise. It's gonna rise more in some places, but there will be no dry spot. There will be no spot that is not impacted by that. So that's something I think a lot about as someone who is committed to living in South Florida for a good little minute, because this is where my parents are, and I'm deeply connected to them and supporting them in a very specific kind of way. Anyways, I'm always thinking about land. I'm always thinking about land as pedagogy, meaning that land has things to teach us for those who want to listen and make themselves available. And that's also part of our Indigenous siblings teach us this. So today I'm really happy to be in conversation with a friend of mine, someone who I met at the University of British Columbia, someone who's also from the United States, and who we connected on some things, and we've remained friends, and someone who I really respect on this topic. And the thing I love most about our friendship is it doesn't matter what we're talking about. It could be pop culture. It could be something random. And we always come back to the land and the climate disaster. And sometimes I thought, if people were eavesdropping on our conversation, they would think, man, they're really morbid or really weird. Why are they always talking about the climate disaster in a very particular kind of way? But actually, that's one of my favorite parts about our friendship, because it keeps me honest, because I am in a state, I'm in a city where a lot of people are in denial about what is on the horizon. And this friendship keeps me clear-eyed and sober-minded, and understanding that actually shit is real and it's about to get really real. So with that said, I want to introduce you all to Kendra Jewel, KJ, who is an anthropologist student at the University of British Columbia, who is PhD candidate in the process of writing their dissertation. They almost done with the chapters. I am envious of them. And they are also my dissertation accountability partner. We meet up every Sunday, and I tell KJ how I usually didn't meet whatever goals I said I was gonna meet, because that's just how the dissertation process goes. So I am going to be quiet, and we're gonna start. First of all, introduce yourself. What do you think is cool for people to know about you? What do you think is cool for people to know about you? And also start telling us about your dissertation. What is it? How did you arrive to it? And what are you attempting to do?
Thank you, Lutzi. That was a very, very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Kendra. I am coming to you from Vancouver, the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So I grew up in San Diego, California. Happy to be here. Lutzi, again, thanks for having me. You are somebody who pushes me constantly to be a better version of myself. So we are accountability partners in our dissertation, but I also count you as an accountability partner in my life, and I thank you for that. Yeah, the question that really started it all for me was that given what we know about climate change, right, including its influence on things like hurricanes and heat waves and rising seas, which are happening all over the world, but in a particular way in South Florida, right? Why are people still moving to Florida in droves, right? Before COVID, it was like 900 people a day were moving to Florida. Why are they still building condos on the water when there are octopuses in parking garages, right? That logic didn't make sense to me, but I knew there had to be one, right? As an anthropologist, somebody who's really interested in the story and people's cultures and logics behind what they do, I had a gut feeling that exceeded just money and greed, right? So I started my research in Miami, which was a practical decision. Also, you were there, so it was nice to spend some time with you in Miami. The plan was to spend 4 months there and then 4 months on the Gulf Coast and then 4 months in the Everglades to kind of get a multi-sided situation. Of course, it didn't work out like that because I had COVID happen right in the middle and I had to come back to Canada, but that's okay. We run with our fieldwork. The week I moved into my apartment in Miami was also the week right before Hurricane Dorian, which I know, Lucy, you remember. And that was a huge climate change fueled hurricane, which, was slated for a little bit of time to hit Miami. It didn't, it devastated the Bahamas, but that was my entry into my fieldwork, right? This oppressive, scary, shuddered, but also like sort of morbidly exciting period of waiting, right? And I use that experience to sort of analyze how climate change impacts us, the time and the temporality of climate change, impact us more generally, what it feels like to wait for an experience and be haunted by disaster all at once, and sort of how privilege plays into that. And then because of who I was talking to in Miami, we're talking activists, policymakers, scientists, I also start to get into these hidden kinds of denialisms that we see on the sort of left, right? In particular, in Miami, I was looking at these infrastructural upgrades, right? This idea that even though Miami has water coming for it, as you said, from all sides, from underneath, from that limestone, from the side, from those rising seas, and also more rain is projected from Miami, right? We assume we can control that water, right? That we can hold back the ocean, given the right engineering, the right studies, enough cement. It's a seductive prospect and a historical habit based in cultures of control that I don't think we can separate from colonialism or capitalism or white supremacy, right? Themes that, we talk about a lot. And then I also talk about outright denial, right? I headed to the Gulf Coast after Miami, where there's a lot of sort of Trumpist, rightist climate change deniers. And they didn't believe climate change was real on a base level. These are people who would, in the same breath, say climate change is a socialist plot, right? And also, I'm going to put my house on stilts next week, right? And so that dissonance is kind of at the heart of one of my chapters too. There's so much to unpack in that dissonance, right? But one important thing is that it's not just that people aren't believing scientists, it's also that they're not believing their own experiences, right? There are incredible logics people have to use to justify that kind of dissonance. And some of it's because, they're bigoted, but a lot of it is because they're scared, not really for their life, I don't think, but for their relevance, right? And I think we have to get out ahead of that because there's something violent lurking there.
I want to hear more about this dissonance. I want to hear more about the gradations of the denialism that you were seeing among the Trumpists, among the rightists, and among the 900 some odd different people who are moving to this place every day. Because what I think your work does is it does this beautiful thing of showing how we are more alike than we would like to admit. And that because we are all human, we all lie to ourselves in the same way, and we all do the conflict avoidance in the same way. And climate disaster is a huge conflict that our species has, most of our species has to agree to confront together. And we can't agree on nothing. So that's going to make it hard. And then you're saying something about it's not quite as simple as being anti-science as opposed to I'm afraid of losing my own relevance. So if you could talk about that, like the dissonance, the gradations in denialism that you're seeing among the ideological fault lines, and give us more about this. Like, it's not quite anti-science. That's not, we can't just chalk it up to that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. I mean, so as we know, okay, climate change is starting to become part of the everyday lexicon of the people, right? It's on a lot of people's minds. People in North America are worried about it. Most of them believe it's real. A lot of them have a rudimentary idea of how it operates, right? This is a good thing. The consciousness about the thing has been raised, right? But as we talk about, there's something that hasn't quite filtered into the body to affect how people move in the world. And that's what you're talking about when you say, yeah, everybody, you know, my buddies in Miami, they know climate change is real and they're still buying houses, right? It's like, it isn't quite filtering into the body, into what is anthropologists call habitus, which is like all of the invisible hands that move us without us even thinking about it. It's not really impacting us on the level of dreams, right? We're still imagining our futures in a lot of the same ways, right? We still want the house. We still want the 3-4 kids. We still want to eat meat 5 times a day, right? We still imagine our futures in many of the ways we did when we were, you know, 6, 7, 8 years old. You know, of course, there are still climate change outright deniers, right? There are vested interests there, and that needs to be talked about, right? Climate change sort of ballooned into this public consciousness in the so-called like post-truth era, which is so filled with double speak and like misinformation that, you know, evidence can be found to, you know, support almost any agenda, right? At this point, I would say it almost goes without saying that, you know, corporations have exploited uncertainties inherent to the climate science for material gain, right? And that needs to be talked about. But what's happening now is that these corporations know that they can no longer say that it's not happening, right? And people will believe them. What's happening now and what I'm seeing in this kind of rightist denialism is that it's more of an insidious question making. You know, it's asking questions. Well, what would happen if? You know, it sends people off into a sort of fractal question world where they start to doubt everything, right? And that exceeds climate change. You know, we see this manifesting, I'm getting off topic a little bit, but we see this kind of fractal question world manifesting also in sort of COVID denialism, right? All of these denialisms are connected, right? And we can talk about that a little bit later too. But for those of us who believe in climate change, right, we go to the rallies, we donate to climate justice causes, right? We believe the science. What's interesting is that displacing, you know, I see a lot of those people displacing blame for, you know, climate change related issues on those outright climate change deniers, while those people, you know, who go to those rallies, who live in those urban areas, often have a much higher carbon footprint, right, than those sort of rural rightist outright climate change deniers, right? This is not to say that, you know, we shouldn't fight that outright denialism, but it is just to say that, look, those of us on the left or in these spaces that believe in climate change, right? What does it mean when we're displacing all of our blame onto these outright climate change deniers when we actually have a higher carbon footprint, right? Yeah, that's where I would start there.
Oh, juicy. For example, how is our carbon footprint a little higher than the folks in the rural, whatever? Because again, I'm just assuming that the folks who are going to be watching this are probably not well versed in this kind of speak that we are. Mm-hmm. So when you say, you know, I'm imagining us city slickers who live in really nice big cities, drive cars, blah 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 blah. Tell me more. For example, how are we? For example,
yeah. Maybe those people have a wider spread of kinship, right? So they're traveling further to see family members. They're taking more flights, or they're in urban areas that don't have their own food systems sort of localized. So they're flying in oranges from Chile, right? There are lots of ways in which, you know, people in these sort of urban settings, with money, right? And this is a lot of the people that I was speaking to, these sort of, I would say, like city officials and government officials, people like this, who have money in these urban areas, who are flying a lot, who have 2 cars and 3 kids, right? versus somebody who is in these more rural communities who has a very regional lifestyle, you know, in a low impact, low economic impact lifestyle.
Okay, all right, awesome. So what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong when it comes to climate disaster? So even my use of the term climate disaster and instead of using climate change, like if you could make that nuanced difference for us. And also like, what are we here in North America? Because there are actually quite a few Canadians who are Patreon members. So there's also that. So I have a good mix, I think, but mainly US. So in terms of North America, in terms of the United States, in terms of Canada, what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong?
I mean, yes, this is a great question. You know, what are we getting right? Again, I think what we've gotten right is that people, you know, the consciousness has been raised, right? I think in most cases, people are aware of and worried about climate change in North America, right? Studies show that. The problem is, you know, this, again, it's not filtering into how those people live their lives. It's filtering into their anxieties and their worries and sort of where they're putting their activist efforts. And that's great. But it's not filtering into their bodies to change how they imagine their futures, right? As discussed. Another thing we're getting wrong, right, is that there's this separation of sort of climate change activism or mainstream climate change activism from other social causes, right? Like decolonization and racial justice, right? This idea that we just need to decrease the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere and not attend to the sort of existing racial injustices that that underpin modern society, right? You know, the exploitation, you know, that this like incredibly heavy use, resource extractive use of bodies and land required by the current economic system, right? Required and like a hierarchy of what bodies and land matter in the first place, right? And because of this, certain peoples and lands have been rendered disposable as a necessary condition of capitalism, you know, and by extension, the current climate crisis. You know, one of my favorite scholars, Mbembe, says that the quote, the desire for the fullness of humanity is what we all share, right? Arguing that the durability of the world depends on our capacity to reanimate beings and things that seem lifeless, right? And this is a huge intersection with indigenous methodology and knowledge, right? And when we see this in like when rivers are getting personhood and things like this kind of extension of personhood, right? To beings that have been rendered inanimate, beings and peoples who have been rendered inanimate as things, right? As a necessary condition of capitalism, right? This is why anti-racist work is climate change activism, right? Because extending that personhood models the reanimation of lifeless peoples and lands needed to counter unchecked resource exploitation, right? And responsibly mitigate the impacts of climate change, you know? And when we're imagining those futures, right, those climate change futures, we have all of these projections of carbon output, right, and impacts, right? But if we're not simultaneously imagining an anti-racist future, what is that future going to look like? You know, there will be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of climate refugees in the next 100 years, right? If we haven't put in to practice a global anti-racist ethic, you know, that's going to be disastrous, right? And even if we stop all carbon output today, you know, the changes are in many ways locked in. A future that says, you know, all we have to do is mitigate carbon, you know, is not a future I want to live in, because it doesn't account for the fact that we have so many existing social issues, you know, that are they're going to get worse as climate change gets worse, right? Climate change is a threat multiplier. And if we don't simultaneously engage in anti-racism, you know, that future is going to be not one I want to live in.
Oh, this is so good. This is so juicy because because I've been thinking a lot about how decolonization might be coupled with anti-racism, might be the only two things that saves this planet. Because clearly the first inhabitants of this place knew what to do, like in terms of like how to care for the land, in terms of how to do control burns, when to do them, all these kinds of things. It's just like, but because the United States, North America writ large, doesn't really respect treaties, doesn't really respect boundaries, doesn't really respect the sovereignty of these different tribes, that is not leading to our peril. And Noam Chomsky calls our approach to climate disaster as species suicide if we continue down this path. And so what I hear you saying is that an anti-racist ethic, a decolonization, and a supporting of decolonization as not a metaphor, but as a thing, full stop, is the thing that's going to bring us back from the brink of species suicide. I would like to hear more about that.
Right. I mean, yes, 100%. And as an anthropologist, as somebody interested in the body, right, I think that decolonization has to begin in our brains, in our bodies. We have to make the choice to decolonize ourselves, right? And then once we make the choice to decolonize ourselves, right, and as we've talked about, this is not a choice. This is not something that goes, the colonizer doesn't go down with one shot, right? This is a practice of decolonization. Decolonization is not something that happens, right? It's not in the preterite tense. It is a practice, right? And you have to get on board. You have to know how you've been colonized, right? Or at least try to, before you can kind of extend into the world in this ways, right?
So it kind of leads to the next question, like in terms of people who call themselves anti-racist feminists, people who believe in social justice, and people who, yes, I want what my indigenous kin want. I want decolonization. I want them to get their land back and their way of life back. I want an anti-racist future. How should we be thinking and moving when thinking about climate disaster?
Right. I think people really need to get straight with themselves about what it means to decolonize, right? Because those of us who occupy places of privilege, especially white people in North America, right, who purport to want to decolonize, I ask them, are you really ready to give up some stuff? Because it's going to require that you give up some of your privileges, that you lose some stuff.
What's the stuff, KJ? Talk to the white people.
It's money, it's land. It's money, it's land, it's an assumption of dominance, right? Yeah, it's money, it's land, it's an assumption of dominance, right? I think a lot about this idea of control as underpinning, contemporary political systems, and also the positionality of whiteness, right? This assumption of dominance, this assumption of control, right? And this is a really dangerous idea for so many reasons, right? There's this. You know what geoengineering is, Lucy? Have you heard about geoengineering? Okay, geoengineering is this idea that, we can modify the Earth's atmosphere to cool it down, right? To modify it to the extent that we can sort of reverse some of the impacts of global warming, right? Some of these geoengineering solutions include putting like massive like silver base, I think it's silver oxide or something like that. And I'm not a scientist, so excuse me, putting silver based particles into the atmosphere, right? And it will turn the sky white. Elizabeth Colbert has a book called Under a White Sky, right? That just came out, and it's about geoengineering. And she asked this question, are we at a point in the climate crisis where what we need is actually control of control. The assumption of control over the atmosphere, over the Earth, is what got us into this position in the first place, And are we in a position, is stuff so bad right now that what we actually need is control of control to mitigate harm? I think this is incredibly dangerous for lots of reasons, including the fact that we should be incredibly leery of solutions that allow us to continue with the resource extraction, right? Unmitigated, right? The solution requires a totally a reworking of entire economic systems, right? And that is a mind-boggling prospect, to say the least. And this idea of control has the potential to allow us to continue with the status quo, to continue with this resource extraction under the guise that global warming is not getting worse. I think that that's a really dangerous, idea. I do not think that control is what gets us out of the problems that control gave us, right?
Whew. Yes. Wow. There is so much there. Control of control. When we need a radical divestment and just a somatic new relationship to this land, to this time, to this place, and to the things that we think we need, but that's actually creating our own demise. Okay. So, but okay, I mean, we all were socialized in this world, Kendra, and denialism is a habit of white supremacy that is in everyone, irrespective of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and all that good stuff. Like, white supremacy has us paralyzed in a very particular kind of way. Like, so you talked earlier about like, it's in our emotions, but it hasn't made it down to like my decisions about my money, my decisions about where and how I live, how many times a week I eat meat. It hasn't trickled down to those things for everyone. So what is it that your work is showing when it comes to denialism that like everyone is practicing, and that everyone is like, we're all stuck and we're not doing the thing that we need to do? What is it about white supremacy that has got us stuck and held hostage? And that's actually making us like, because again, one would think as human beings, we're wired to want to continue. We're wired to want to survive. But some days I wonder, are we though? COVID has definitely made me rethink that actually, we might not be, everybody within the species might not be wired to survive, because we don't, like, people won't put masks. People won't, I won't even get into the vaccines. But so what is it about survivability and white supremacy that has us actually hustling backwards, as the people say? We're not even like claiming our survivability. What is it about that?
Right. Thank you. Yes, as you like, whiteness at its very core, whiteness requires denialism, right? I would argue even whiteness is denialism, right? It's white supremacy has conditioned all of us to look away from horror since its very founding, right? And continues to ask us to look away from horror, in the context of things like climate change. This is structural, but as you say, it's also somatic, right? And so let me explain that a little further. So understanding whiteness, especially for the white people, right? It's hard for us to think about whiteness, right? We don't like to do it, right? Understanding whiteness as a social category of domination, right? And not just like an arbitrary lack of melanin, as we've talked about before. It's crucial to understanding how power operates today, right, in the world. There's no stable definition of whiteness, which is, I like conceive it as like a trickster, right? It has the ability to take many forms and underpin many positionalities, right? But whiteness as a system of privilege is inseparable from the violent histories attached to, colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade at a minimum. A scholar, Garner, says that whiteness involves, he says, perhaps more than anything, a belief that one has a tradition of dominance, part of a tradition of dominance, including empire, right? And today, whiteness is an embodied assurance in one's own superiority and entitlement that's reaffirmed through profound structural injustices, as well as banal, unconscious interactions, right? The thing is, whiteness is kind of brilliant. Instead of being openly acknowledged, right, it blends into a background of white noise that's experienced but not truly integrated, especially by those who benefit from it, right? Charles Mills argues we operate under an unspoken racial contract that possesses a series of, he says, structured blindnesses and opacities that allow it to exist because people look away from the violence that was necessary to create it in the first place, right? So we can see how denialism is co-constitutive of white supremacy, of whiteness, right? And for Mills, this collective refusal to recognize the racial construct constructs what he calls an inverted epistemology, Okay, epistemology is how we understand the world, how we create knowledge, right? What we understand as true, right? Where large sections of like the global population, they just can't see the horrific truths that underwrite the modern world, right? He says, for the nerds in the room, I'll say what he says, the racial contract prescribes for its signatories an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made, right? That the cognitive dysfunctions are psychologically and socially functional is crucial to how whiteness operates, right? It's so embedded in the minds and social structures that the dysfunctions, the cognitive dysfunctions, that inverted epistemology inherent to whiteness is, invisible. And that is precisely and bizarrely what upholds the status quo, right? And there are so many things we can point to here, right? There are countless everyday examples of what it is to look away from these kinds of horror, right? To buy clothes, we look away from the enslaved hands that made them, to visit families, we look away from the carbon footprint of air travel. To use apps, we look away from conflict mining, right? To maintain relations with white people, we look away from their inverted epistemology, right? All of these acts of looking away, they're cataloged, like no, they're there, but they're not quite integrated. We both know and don't want to know about this horror, right? About climate change, say, that we both inflict and that we receive. So it's so much easier to pretend it's not there, right?
Ooh, this inverted epistemology. Ooh, I like that. And also, I think it's interesting that like being connected to white people, you said we also look away. Ooh, baby, you please. I'm gonna need you to like lean on that point a little more. Like, and I guess my question is like, you are a white person, you are about to be like a doctor in anthropology, and we know all the things that like are attached to anthropology, right? And here you are, a white person who is an anthropologist looking at whiteness and white people and white supremacy. So my question is, A, how did you arrive here? Like, which is different from my original question. Like, how did you arrive here? Like, how did you arrive to this place? And what role does decolonization, feminism, and anti-racism play in your current work? Because like, you're saying some things about whiteness in this conversation that going to sound revolutionary to white people, even though it's like, it's so basic, like you said, it's white noise. It's so part of the everyday that is white noise. So like, how did you become what you're becoming, and what mirrors is this work reflecting back to you about your own whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, historically anthropology was like old white dudes going into often colonial contexts to learn about populations, right, in order to better control them. There's this like colonial past and in many ways colonial present the anthropology is reckoning with. I did my master's work in Nicaragua in Spanish on a massive canal project that was going in there. And I'm proud of that work, but when I came back from it and I was thinking about what I wanted to do for my PhD, it was really important to me to do work in my country of origin, in my native language with predominantly white people, to try to move away from that exploitative relationship anthropology has had and often still has with, indigenous populations and populations of color, right? And as you know, my initial idea for my PhD was to focus on the sort of rise of the alt-right, and do an anthropology project on the rise of the alt-right for various reasons that, I was pushed towards thinking about climate change, but I wanted to maintain that sort of, it felt like a vocation. I needed to maintain that lens, that direction, because it was clear to me, and I didn't know how yet, but it was clear to me that whiteness was operating in the context of climate change and climate change denial in particular, and I wasn't sure how, but I wanted to merge these two ideas, climate change activism, and climate change denial, and whiteness, because I knew there was something there, but I just wasn't quite sure what. How is it in that it's not, and this is gonna maybe, it's not an easy process for a white person to confront whiteness, right? It's scary, and it's vulnerable, and it's also, part of what it means to be an ethical person in today's world. There's nothing more important for a white person to do than really understand, or at least try to understand, how whiteness, has infected their bodies, right? Because of this arbitrary lack of melanin that has filtered into sort of generations of privilege, right? Yeah, and I recognize that my research is going to be radical for a lot of white people. I think it will be obvious to a lot of people of color, and I think it will be radical for a lot of white people. And I don't. That's good. It should be, and my own process of, grieving climate change, is part and parcel to my process of coming to terms with, what it means to be a white person in North America, right?
Ooh, what it means to be a white person in North America. That's a sermon. Okay. The second part of my question is, how does decolonization and, feminism, anti-racism play in that? You got to it a little bit, but if you could make it like really nail it down for folks, because what I tend to find is like people really struggle when I say that like anti-racism is a practice. People are like, oh, like that's interesting. I like that mode. But I think people really struggle to understand, like, actually you have to take this to every aspect of your life. Mm-hmm. Like it's not an elective, it's not a whatever. So thinking about like, how does one live an embodied life that's rooted in their feminism, that's rooted in their social justice, and that's rooted in their like, yeah, I want decolonization for my indigenous kin. Comrades, like I want that. Like, so thinking about like, how are you embodying that in your life personally and professionally, and how is that embodiment showing up in your study of whiteness?
I mean, I think that there are going to be as many answers to this or there would be as many answers to this question as there are people who answer it. For me, one of the basic things I think about is, in the context of decolonizing my body, decolonization in the world, anti-racism, in what ways am I assuming myself master? In what ways am I assuming control in this situation, right? I try my best to approach every situation from, this place of uncertainty as opposed to certainty. I do not presume to know what is best in any situation, right? This epistemology of uncertainty and humility, and not just like a faux humility. This isn't like add anti-racism and stir, right? This isn't like corporate checkboxes. This is like, no, I actually like am uncertain about this situation, about various ways that this thing operates, but I'm open to continuing to shift it. So it's about for me on a base level, stripping away the presumption of my mastery of the world, of knowledge, of, my project, and that comes with it a whole bunch of practical considerations, right? Where and when and how I buy land, where and when and how I donate money, to which causes, right? Where and when how I bank, there are so many practical, practical things that stem from this place of, openness and humility.
So, we don't believe in hacks or how-tos over here, right? Because we know that life is a little bit more complicated than that and nuanced. However, people are going to watch this and will be like, the sky is falling.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only one person. I can't be more responsible and more ethical than my government.
Yeah.
I can't be more ethical and responsible. For instance, I live right now in a community where there's like no recycling bins. Now we know that recycling is not the thing. And I also live in a neighborhood where it's nothing but different kinds of apartments. This is one of the most heavily densely populated places in South Florida, which means it's a lot of people accumulating a lot of trash. And I don't see a lot of care around that. Again, I'm not team recycle. Recycling is the only thing that we can do. However, it's interesting. So there are no how-to, there are no hacks. We're not going to recycle our way out of this climate change disaster. However, when it comes to the ethics, how can I start to practice being a little bit more ethical when it comes to this subject matter?
Yeah, it's really important to note rather that, it is a really interesting problem because individual actions both have very little and also a ton of impact on this issue, right? We know that, 70% of carbon emissions are coming from the top 100 corporations, right? We know that there are, structural reasons why these things aren't changing. We know there's a gridlock in sort of the international climate talks, right? What can individuals do? My answer is complicated, and I think people need to be kind with themselves, right? It's not so easy as not buying from Amazon, taking the train rather than flying, and recycling. I think that's in many ways that's a step in the grieving process people take in their climate change grieving journey, and it's an important one in many ways. We have to integrate the complexity and somehow hold that our actions mean very little and our actions mean a lot. We have to integrate that complexity and really be kind to ourselves in these moments when, we do buy oranges from Chile, right? Because we live in this global system and there are situations where, that's okay. That's okay. I think for me, it's about staying with that complexity. Donna Haraway says, staying with the trouble. It's about not looking away to the extent that you can, right? It's about, and the act of recycling, right? It's important in the act of recycling, but it's also important in the act that you're not looking away from climate change. Every time you recycle, every time you choose to do X thing or Y thing, right? Every time you choose to bike instead of the bus, it's important in its carbon value, right? But it's also important in that it's keeping you focused. It's you're choosing to break out of that habit of denialism, to break out of those structured blindnesses and opacities, right? You're choosing to look at the thing every time you can. I think that is, at the core of how we change the culture, right? And as an anthropologist, I'm all about cultures, right? We have to change the culture. And to change the culture, we can do it. It's underwritten into our brains, into our neural pathways, right? But psychologists tell us all the time that we can break out of those neural pathways. We can make new ones, you know? And yeah, it starts by not looking away.
Is there anything about your project or about this subject matter that you are not usually asked, or that I did not ask you today, that you would like to make really clear to whoever might end up listening to you and watching this?
No, it's interesting because I think that the questions that you've asked are the questions that people often avoid in the context of my work, right? So I think we've gotten to the heart of the argument, the heart of the thing, which is that there is a giant structure, there is a giant umbrella of denialism that is required by the global order, right? And all of these things, climate change denial, COVID denial, various iterations of climate change denial, whether you believe it and you're looking away from it, or you choose to not believe it at all, right? They all fall under this broader systemic culture of denialism that, was required to create and maintain the white supremacist state. And, how we untangle that is, there are infinitely many ways and paths we have to take to untangle that. And your path is personal. And I just, empower you to figure out what it is and take it.
That's a really good note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you.